Dawn breaks over Gaza, not with birdsong, but with the echoes of uncertainty. The smoke from the night's bombardment still lingers in the air, tinted orange by the early light. Streets once filled with life now carry only whispers of survival. And as the world wakes to another fragile morning, officials on television speak of progress, ceasefires, and humanitarian corridors, but behind those diplomatic words lie deals no one dares to fully explain. This is the story of Gaza's fragile dawn, a story of hidden negotiations, quiet betrayals, and the desperate human cost behind every so-called truce. In the chaos of war, truth becomes a currency more valuable than gold and more easily manipulated. Governments issue statements of hope while jets circle above. Political leaders promise peace while planning the next strike, and the people caught in between, families, children, medics, and hostages, become bargaining chips in a global game played far beyond Gaza's borders. But how did we reach this point? Why are ceasefires so short-lived and hostage swaps so carefully choreographed? What is really happening behind closed doors in Doha, Tel Aviv, Washington, and Cairo? To understand Gaza's fragile dawn, we must rewind to a day that shook the region and reshaped global diplomacy. It began with blood and fire. In the early hours of that October morning, militants breached the border fence, storming Israeli towns, taking civilians and soldiers hostage. The world watched in horror as videos flooded the internet, chaos, screaming flames. In retaliation, Israel launched a massive offensive, vowing to eradicate him as once and for all. Weeks turned into months. The bombardment reduced neighborhoods to rubble, hospitals ran out of fuel. The humanitarian crisis deepened, and in the background, a new kind of diplomacy began, one conducted not at formal summits, but in back rooms, secret channels, and encrypted phone calls. At the center of these negotiations were three players: Israel, Hamas, and Qatar. Doha became the invisible bridge between enemies who could not speak directly. Egyptian intelligence mediated on the ground, shuttling proposals and counter-proposals across borders. The United States, too, played its hand, urging restraint publicly while approving weapons shipments privately. What the public heard were the sanitized statements: talks are progressing, both sides have agreed in principle, hostage releases imminent. But behind those lines, the reality was far darker. Every hostage swap came with a hidden price. For every Israeli freed, dozens of Palestinian prisoners were demanded in return, many of them teenagers, activists, or those detained without formal charges. For every pause in airstrikes, there were political concessions exchanged through unofficial channels, and for every promise of a humanitarian truce, new surveillance drones and weapons shipments quietly changed hands. Diplomacy, in this context, became less about saving lives and more about managing optics. Each government sought to appear strong before its own people while signaling flexibility to the international community. In Israel, public anger over the government's failure to prevent the initial attacks pushed leaders into a corner. Prime Minister Netanyahu faced growing pressure from families of hostages who demanded their loved ones return at any cost. But within his cabinet, hardliners warned that too many concessions would signal weakness. Meanwhile, in Gaza, Hamas saw the hostages as leverage, not just to secure prisoner releases, but to force the world to acknowledge their relevance in Palestinian politics. Behind closed doors, Hamas negotiators insisted on guarantees, not just for aid trucks or temporary truces, but for political recognition and long-term influence in any post-war governance of Gaza. And then there were the brokers, Qatar and Egypt, each with their own motives. Qatar's involvement was both humanitarian and strategic. Hosting Hamas political leadership gave Doha unique influence, one that Western powers tolerated as long as it delivered results. For Egypt, the stakes were more personal, keeping its border calm, its leadership seen as indispensable, and its fragile peace with Israel intact. Yet every step forward in negotiations was shadowed by mistrust. Israel accused mediators of shielding militants. Hamas accused Israel of sabotaging agreements. American officials spoke of progress while quietly admitting that no deal ever truly held. And in the middle of all of it, civilians. Families in Gaza waited hours at makeshift shelters, listening for word of a truce that might let aid trucks through. Mothers clung to photos of missing children. Fathers dug through rubble with bare hands. Across the border, Israeli families held nightly vigils, their candles flickering against the darkness, hoping their sons, daughters, or parents were still alive somewhere underground. When the first hostage exchange finally happened, cameras captured the moment: tearful reunions, flags waving, world leaders applauding. But few noticed the unspoken truths. The exchange was uneven. For every one Israeli released, several Palestinians walked free. The optics were managed carefully. Israeli TV showed joyful returns. Palestinian channels broadcast stories of prisoners who had spent years behind bars for throwing stones or organizing protests. It was a day of relief for some, and a reminder for others that peace here is always conditional, always fragile. The so-called ceasefire that followed was fragile from the start. While officials celebrated it as a breakthrough, both sides were already preparing for what would come after. On the ground, aid convoys entered Gaza, but reports emerged that fuel shipments were being restricted, that medical supplies were running low, that communication blackouts hid new movements of troops. Within days, the truce collapsed. Bombs fell again, rockets returned, the fragile dawn turned once more into night of fire, and yet the world's headlines moved on. For millions trapped inside Gaza, every ceasefire felt like a cruel joke, a brief pause to count the dead before the next round began. For negotiators, it was a calculated pause, time to reshuffle demands, measure international outrage, and reset the narrative. For world powers, it was an opportunity. Behind every humanitarian gesture, there were deals for influence: who would control reconstruction contracts, who would oversee aid distribution, who would shape the political future of Gaza once the bombs stopped falling. And as diplomats twisted progress, a new kind of conflict emerged, one fought not with missiles, but with misinformation. State media, influencers, and even official spokespeople began shaping the narrative. Videos of released hostages were edited to evoke sympathy or defiance. Statistics were contested, death tolls questioned, footage discredited. Each side accused the other of manipulation, and in the fog of war, truth became the first casualty. But there is another layer, one rarely discussed openly. Intelligence sources from the region whisper of side deals, agreements made under the table involving not just hostages or aid, but future control of Gaza's governance. As international pressure mounted, talk began of a post-Hamas Gaza, administered by regional partners under UN oversight. But behind those diplomatic phrases, real people wondered what that meant for them. Another occupation, another government, or simply another cycle of promises. And yet, amid all this, hope still flickers. In the ruins of Gaza, volunteers distribute food from what little remains. Doctors continue working through sleepless nights. Journalists risk their lives to show the world what's happening beyond official statements. On both sides of the border, there are those who still believe, against all logic, that peace, however fragile, is still worth pursuing. But hope is not the same as peace, and every dawn here comes with a price. When negotiators in five-star hotels speak of humanitarian pauses, people in Gaza hear it as another countdown, a race to find water, bread, or medicine before the next explosion. When leaders claim progress, it often means more strategic positioning, not compassion. And so, the question remains: if ceasefires are lies, if hostage swaps are leverage, if every truce is temporary, what is the real goal? Some say it's deterrence, others say it's survival. But for those caught in between, it feels like perpetual punishment, a war with no winners, only survivors. The hidden deals behind the scenes are not written in ink. They are written in silence, in the pauses between airstrikes, in the coded language of diplomats, in the trembling hands of those waiting for news of loved ones. And while cameras capture moments of relief, a child stepping off a bus, a soldier embracing his mother, the machinery of negotiation keeps turning. Each hostage becomes a bargaining chip. Each truce becomes a test. Each dawn becomes another fragile promise that this day might be different. But as history has shown, in Gaza, dawn is never just dawn. It is a fragile line between survival and collapse, between truth and propaganda, between diplomacy and deceit. And in the shadows of these hidden deals, something larger is taking shape. Global powers are quietly redrawing the map of influence. The United States seeks to stabilize the region without appearing weak. Iran measures every move, waiting for the right moment to escalate or pull back. Arab governments walk a fine line between their people's outrage and their political interests. And the United Nations, stretched thin and divided, tries to mediate, knowing that even the smallest misstep could unravel everything. Meanwhile, the people, ordinary families, children, journalists, and doctors, continue to live, to grieve, and to hope in the ruins of policy decisions they never made. Every deal signed in secret carries a human cost that will never be televised. Every truce broken leaves scars deeper than rubble. Every lie told in the name of peace delays the real conversation, the one about justice, rights, and the dignity of every life caught in this endless cycle. Gaza's fragile dawn is not just a metaphor. It is a mirror reflecting the contradictions of our world, a place where politicians speak of peace while civilians dig graves, where the language of diplomacy hides the language of suffering, where global leaders perform compassion for cameras, then return to strategy tables lit by fluorescent light. And still, the sun rises every day over ruins, over tents, over headlines that fade too quickly. The question is not whether another ceasefire will hold. It is whether the world will finally see through the illusions, the lies that paint cruelty as necessity and compromise as weakness. Because behind every deal, there are faces. Behind every ceasefire, there are stories. Behind every hostage swap, there are mothers who wait, children who grow up too fast, and generations who learn to live with loss as their only constant. And until those stories are heard, not as political talking points, but as human truths, the dawn over Gaza will remain fragile, flickering, always on the edge of darkness. This is Gaza, where every dawn is both an ending and a beginning. And the world still has not learned how to choose between the two.